Erasmus University Rotterdam, and we'll also be joined by Dohoya Sinders, who is an innovation counselor for India at the Dutch Embassy in New Delhi, India. At the end of the session, we'll take a couple of questions, both remote and in person, so we'll come run the mics to you. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody here in the room and also the onlookers worldwide online. My name is Evert-Jan Mulder, and I will be the first presenter on this wonderful conference. I'm really honored to be invited by this conference. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd like to talk with you about multi-level governance. And what we did, and if I talk about we, I will introduce my co-presenter later. He will be joining us from Delhi, if everything with the technology works well. But I want to talk with you about multi-level governance, and we have a metaphor when it comes to the implementation of multi-level governance. And I don't know if you know this game, the telephone game. If one person whispers a message into the ear of another and this person continues to the other, and well, then it's always interesting what is the result and how does it relate to the original message. And you often find out that there is a totally different result than the original message due to miscommunication, different interpretations, etc. We used this metaphor for some lessons learned about the implication and the implementation of e-government in a multi-level governance setting. And talking about settings, well, for you, this is all not new, but for me, I'm walking around here in the Oxford premises, and I found a quote of the famous poet and writer, Mr. William Butler Yeats, and, well, you can read it. He thinks the place is so beautiful, one almost expects the people to sing instead of speaking here. It's like an opera. But with your permission, I keep to speaking instead of singing. And I think also my co-presenter, which I saw in the corner of the PowerPoint, will agree with that. Okay. There he is. I already introduced myself a little bit. My name is Evert-Jan Mulder, but I'm affiliated with the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, but also an independent consultant for public sector digital transformation in the Netherlands. And my co-presenter is Dohoya Sinders, who is joining us from Delhi, India, where Dohoya works as an innovation counselor for the Dutch Embassy. Dohoya, perhaps you can say a short hello to the audience.
Yes, thank you, Evert-Jan. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. Namaste, everybody from India. I used to work together with Evert-Jan on all kinds of matters of public information management within the Dutch government. But now, indeed, I'm the Science and Innovation Counselor for the Netherlands government here in India. I would have loved to have been there. It looks like a beautiful place. Hear the people singing, but the G20 meetings here are keeping me busy. Actually, also a forum in which we're discussing technology, digitalization, and also multi-level governance. But that said, really glad to participate digitally.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. A short look at the agenda I want to discuss with you. First, a few words on multi-level governance, especially for those who are not familiar with the concept. Then we will talk a little bit about the research we did, and last but not least, of course, some conclusions and recommendations. Okay, multi-level governance. It's a broad concept, but in essence, it's about dispersion of power and authority between different levels of government, national, supranational, but also regional and local. And it's not only about dispersion of power in between levels of government, but also with private actors and civil society. So from a perspective of government, it's upwards and downwards, but also sideways. This is a definition which we took from Daniel and Kay, Australian researchers, and there is not much discussion about it. However, when it comes to designing and implementing multi-level governance systems, there is a lot of discussion because it's difficult to find the right fit for different contexts and for different policies issues. And I think what we discuss with you, the case we discuss with you, will illustrate this. A little about the background of the concept of multi-level governance, because I already referred to Australian researchers, but in Europe, the concept is very much related to the development of the European Union. In 1992, the Treaty of Maastricht was signed, and that marked the start of the European Union. Before that, we talked about a European economic community, but since then we have the Union, which has more power and authority not only on the economic field, but also in foreign policy and police and justice sectors. So the concept of multi-level governance is in Europe very much related to the foundation of the European Union, where national governments found themselves not only dealing with regional and local authorities, but also with this new actor, the European Union. And in the EU literature, the EU is often described as an institution sui generis, a very special one, because it's different than other international organizations like NATO or the UN or OECD, because it has all these powers. Okay, so far for the concept of multi-level governance. Let's introduce our study and the research we did. As Doja already explained, we are both from the field of e-government. We were working in e-government in the Netherlands. And we were assigned by, and working for the province of North Brabant. I will introduce that later to you. And they were dealing with a directive from the European Union, and that had to be implemented. So this was a good opportunity for us to research the implementation of a supranational idea at a regional and subnational level. And why was it in particular interesting for us? Because e-government, and I think most people in this room will agree, is by far and mostly a national affair. You have national plans, national programs. E-government is a national thing, at least when we look at it in Europe. And here comes the European Union with all kinds of ideas and policies on the field of e-government. And one of them, and that was the trigger for our research, was the Services Directive. So our research question was more or less how to deliver public value by implementing e-government in the multi-level setting, and the case was the EU Services Directive. For those who don't know what the Services Directive was, although the UK was still part of the EU at that time, EU Services Directive is a directive that tries to promote a cross-border business in Europe. In theory, the European Union is based on 4 pillars: free flow of goods, capital, people, and services. But that's the theory. In practice, you see a lot of legal and technical barriers. And in the discussion about the Services Directive in the Netherlands, there was this example of a Polish plumber who wanted to do business in the Netherlands, but he was situated in Krakow, and how could he start his business in the Netherlands, where there were very fond of Polish plumbers at that time, because we did a lot of reconstruction in our houses. So there had to be something that would make it easy for this Polish plumber to do his business cross-border. So the idea, and this was part of the Services Directive, which also addressed other issues for improving cross-border services. But one of the issues in this directive was the introduction of a point of single contact. And this point of single contact, in the context of the Netherlands, was implemented by setting up a message box in the national government's business portal. And the idea was that all kinds of subnational authorities, provinces, but also municipalities, would connect to this message box, and for an enterprise, either Dutch or a European, they only had to go to this message box to find and deal with the formalities of the government. Here you get the idea of the point of single contact, and well, I think it speaks for itself. Imagine the Polish plumber as the enterprise in the old situation. From Krakow, he had to find his way to, well, in the Netherlands we have 1,600 government institutions, so he had to find his way amongst these 1,600. In the new situation, he only had to go to this point of single contact, where he could select his particular municipality, where he would start his business and deal with the formalities of that government agency. So that was the idea of the point of single contact. A few words where we did our research. Well, you all know, hopefully, where the Netherlands is located, and we are on the other side of the North Sea from here. And we did this research for the province of Noord-Brabant. And Noord-Brabant is one of the 12 provinces in the Netherlands, almost 2.5 million inhabitants. And there are 67 municipalities. And this area is a rather rural area with a few cities. And these few cities, well, there is a very famous innovation ecosystem located, perhaps you've heard of it, Brainport. A company, a high-tech company like ASML, world leader in semiconductors, is located over there. And this company plays a role in the contest between the US and China when it comes to technical hegemony. So there is a lot going on, and also this province saw the EU Services Directive as a initiative where they could be and show that they were a front runner, because they really liked also as a government to be innovative in the field of e-government. That's why they wanted to implement this Services Directive early and in the right way. So, just to summarize our case, we had the EU Services Directive at the supranational level of Brussels. That was the idea, was the decision taken. This decision was brought to the national government in the Netherlands. They had to do the transposition of the legislation, but they also had to implement in a technical way this point of single contact by way of a message box in the national government business portal. And last but not least, subnational authorities like provinces, but also municipalities, had to implement this and had to connect to this message box. In the middle is the user, in this case the enterprise, the Polish plumber, which had to use this facility to get his public value. Okay, a few words about methodology, because I see there are a lot of researchers also in the room. We used three types of methods. We did mystery shopping, which I will tell a little bit about later. And we did interviews, semi-structured interviews by telephone with those municipalities who connected to this message box. And we asked them if they connected, and if not, what was the problem, all these kinds of questions. And we had some open interviews. We went to several of these municipalities also to see how this message box was working. And so it was not only tell me, but also show me. And these people gave a very good insight in what their deal was with this message box. About the mystery shopping, and perhaps Doya, I don't know if you can get into the presentation.
Yes, of course.
Perhaps you can, because...
Yeah, I think on the mystery shopping, for us it was really important to not only hear opinions about what people thought about the message box, but also to have direct insight in, oh, I like it how I'm moving there, how the system worked. So not only from hearsay, but we wanted to see directly how the municipalities were reacting to messages. So what we did is we set up a fake company, Filmhuis NL, and we created an account in this message box, and we sent through this account requests to all 67 different municipalities, and it was a request to film in the municipality, and also one with certain specific acts that we knew required special film permits. So we thereby wanted to test very much how they responded, but also if they responded, and I think Evert-Jan will say a little bit more about that. But on the more ethical side of the research, we also beforehand, of course, had a lot of talks with the provincial government about this, how to do this, and if we should do this, and also informed everybody afterwards about the research. And I think it's a good way to test the actual use of such a system. Back to you, Evert-Jan.
Yeah, thank you. So, of course, this was a fake company, and we had to register at the Chamber of Commerce because otherwise it was not possible to send a message as a company to these municipalities. But also because we were acting on behalf of the province of North Brabant, which were of course informed and involved in our research. We had to send a formal letter after 3 weeks to these municipalities to explain we were conducting this research and that the company in fact was fake. But this kind of research gave us a real nice insight in how the municipalities were connected to this message box and how they responded to our request to shoot a film in the municipality. So here you see, we send a request, can we shoot a film, and do we need permits, yes or no? And this is the results we got after through 3 weeks. So the majority, 54%, gave no answer at all. We got a proper answer, though, from 1/3 of the municipalities. 3% of them confirmed that they received our request, and 12% they answered us that we needed to use a different medium to contact them for this question. So, well, if you see this, then it's obvious that there is still a lot of work to do to create this public value for the Polish plumber in Krakow if he wants to connect with Dutch municipalities, because more than half did not use the message box. And of course then it's interesting to see what are reasons for this, more or less rather poor performance. So these are some main results from the interviews we conducted. And what we found out was that, first of all, there was hardly any user participation when the idea of this point of single contact was conducted. And I have to say a little bit more about this, because the EU Services Directive was a really broad package of legislation. And this point of single contact was just one of the minor articles. So there was a lot of discussion about all kinds of other parts of the Services Directive, because there was also in it that this idea of free services and free labor. To put it right, it was also in the Services Directive that to allow the Polish plumber even to do business in the Netherlands. That was a large part of the political discussion. And the point of single contact facilitated this Polish plumber how to do this business. So a lot of discussion on major legislative issues, but there was hardly any discussion and also user participation if this concept of the point of single contact was even feasible, or if it should work at all or not. That was one of the things we got back from the interviews. Also, and perhaps this was part of the Dutch attitude towards EU policies at that moment, but the EU Services Directive, and in particular the point of single contact, was perceived as, well, let's call it a shotgun implementation. We had to do this from Brussels. That was the idea. And in the Netherlands, especially within the national government, the why of the EU services and the point of single contact was poorly understood. So if that's the attitude at the national government, this also flows to subnational levels. That's not a good message to address. Also, what we found out, because we also looked at some of the other countries, we saw that every country almost had its own interpretation and its own idea of the point of single contact. So, for example, and this, if this Polish plumber was active and tried to do business in several countries in Europe, he had to do business with the Dutch point of single contact, where the German point of single contact had a different setup and design, and the Austrian also a different one, and etc. So there was not a uniformed way of implementing points of single contact in Europe. So you could ask yourself questions about the public value for a business that wanted to conduct business in several countries. I already said something about the shotgun implementation attitude at the national level, but it also, if you looked at the subnational level, at the level of the municipalities, well, and also we heard it in our interviews, there was a real poor organizational implementation. Well, perhaps to put it a little bit black and white, but the implementation of this point of single contact was just a technical switch of connecting municipalities to this national message box. Well, if they switch me on to a new system and don't tell me how to use it and why to use it, well, you know what to expect. But that was more or less what happened. And then, of course, you can set up a facility like a message box, but imagine there are at this moment 350 municipalities in the whole of the Netherlands. At that time, I think we had 500 municipalities, but we have a continuous process of reorganizing and fusions of municipalities. So if you look for a municipality A, but that change into another municipality for an enterprise, it was really hard to find this if the maintenance of the facility was not done in a correct way. And that was something we observed, and that is, of course, not the correct way. Last but not least, I think a point of attention was that there was hardly any marketing of the existence of the point of single contact to enterprises, not even to Dutch companies, and also not to European countries or European companies. So hardly anyone knew of the existence of the facility. And a few years later, we talked to the people who worked with the point of single contact, and the traffic was still really slow on this facility. So they even said you can better hire a taxi to go from Krakow to send the messages to the Netherlands than install this message box, because in the end it was a rather costly thing. Okay, main conclusion. Well, we started with the telephone game, and that's also something we want to end with when it comes to the conclusion, because what we observed was that implementing e-services in a multi-level governance context is something like playing the telephone game. You have an original idea at the level of the Brussels, the supranational level, and when you see what the outcome is at the subnational level, well, it was totally different than the idea than what was originally in the heads of the people in Brussels. We wrote an article we, Doya and me, we wrote an article for Government Information Quarterly about this case, where you can find all the details about what I just told. So hopefully it's accessible for you to get this article. And of course, then if you look at the whole research and the conclusions, well, what could be recommendations? From our perspective, we would suggest that at the and in multi-level governance terms, that actors should act and interact more closely, and also in a non-hierarchical way with each other. Because the concept of the telephone game also means you go from one shackle to another shackle, and that increases the risks of misinterpretations and miscommunication. But there should be a more holistic approach, and for example, the European Union also should have a closer eye on what is the end result of this whole thing, and interact and intervene if they see that what is the end result was not the original idea. So, and I have to say, fortunately, the EU is stepping up its game in this perspective, because they are now more closely watching what is the end result. And one thing they also do is they switch in their digital strategy from legislation by directives, which leaves room and opportunity to the national governments to implement the concept, to acts and regulations, which are much more strict and are uniform for all the countries to implement. So the fact that you have 27 at that time different interpretations of the point of single contact, they are trying to avoid that situation by switching more from directives to regulations and acts. Another recommendation, at least because most of us are active in a national context if it comes to implementing e-government, but another recommendation from that perspective is that we should pay much more attention to what is happening at the supranational level, and we should integrate those supranational policies much more in our national and subnational programs and plans. Because if you look how the EU is developing with its digital strategy, it's really encompassing. In fact, they are developing a whole digital infrastructure in Europe. And for countries, they really have to pay attention how to connect to this infrastructure to be able to do all kinds of businesses with each other as governments, but also to allow their businesses and their citizens to enjoy the four freedoms of Europe. And, well, when I look at the Netherlands, there is still a way to go. The attitude is different nowadays. We acknowledge the importance of Europe, but we still have to find the ways in a more practical manner how to integrate European policies at the national and the other levels. Well, I'm almost at the end of our presentation. I was really inspired by the Keep Calm posters, so that would be my last shot for you. We still have enough time left to take questions and then start some discussion.
It's my understanding that there's a very small number of German-speaking people,
Yes.
but that there's a greater number that apparently speak a language that precedes Dutch. For some reason, a lot of airline pilots from the Netherlands speak it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
It's a very ancient language which has a very firm conviction of its antecedents. Did you run into that? What am I aiming at? What is that language?
Yeah, well, that language is bad English. What happened is, of course, you have, I think, in Brussels, they have translators for 23 different languages. So all legislation is translated in 23 official languages for all the countries of Europe. And of course, it was not feasible for every single country and point of single contact to offer services in 23 or 22 different languages to other countries. So, well, it was more or less agreed upon that English would be the language to translate the point of single contact information and formalities to. So the Polish plumber, if he wanted to do business in the Netherlands, well, he had to understand some English to find his way through the point of single contact, because it was not in Polish language, and it was also not in Greek. We did it in English. Yeah. Is that an answer to your?
Well, that's a partial answer. In constructing things like a hybrid conference that's going to India, where there are 870 languages, or there are places like Canada where language is a very, very alive political issue.
Yeah.
And looking at your model, and I was trying to think of using some great insights you had today in the United States. We have, for example, several million indigenous people who are asserting their language rights. Did you come to terms with it? Did you try to fight your way through with it?
Yeah, but more or less in Europe, because we also had discussions, what are official languages? Because is Gaelic, which is spoken only by a small part of the people, is it an official language? Yes, it is now in the translation of the European Union. So this discussion, what is a formal language and which language do you need to address in official publications and facilities, it was decided upon at the level of the EU. And for example, in the Netherlands, we have also the Frisian language, which is spoken by some in a northern province of the Netherlands. But the Dutch government does not address that language in particular. It's in plain Dutch and not in Frisian. Although some of the municipality plates, if you enter a municipality, it's also in Frisian. That's okay, but does that address? And I think this, or perhaps Doya, who is working in India, perhaps you can add some words to this discussion.
Yeah, I think if we bring it back to the message box, and what we see is there that the policy, of course, is very centralized from Brussels, but then actually the operationalization and the implementation was decentralized. And I think also one of the takeaways for me, at least, is that decentralization that is necessary where it's possible, but a lot of the discussion and even the implementation phase and the operationalization phase has to be also centralized partially, because you cannot have the member states themselves deciding what are the official languages of their IT application. This has to be a central discussion. And I think also there were one or two systems that were making it only in their own language because it was also at a big national use. So I think that is also the outcome of our study. Even in the design phase of the IT tools, there has to be a lot of communication with a lot of stakeholder input from all regions to make it an equitable, fair, and also effective tool.
Thank you. Yeah, gives a little bit more perspective on this issue, which is a very difficult one to tackle, especially in the digital world, of course. Yeah. Other questions? Do we have online questions?
Thank you very much for your great presentation. And actually, when you mentioned about 3 levels of government, I reflected my experience in Burma, called Myanmar, and we have got these problems because whether we have to adopt the ASEAN level strategy as a supranational strategy for the digitalization, as well as whether we should focus on the national strategy. But sometimes we have got some problems by the subnational bodies as a challenge to centralization if we design the digital trade infrastructure, for example, and also when we design the one-stop services by integrating all the bodies, but we have faced the same problem like yours in Netherlands, like the kind of no national marketing, and then different public values, and then different IT system and poor coordination. So maybe my question is, which level should we focus as a priority? Thank you very much.
Okay, that's an interesting question. Yeah, well, digitalization, of course, makes borders and different levels of governments more transparent, and you have the idea of, for a user, it's one system. It doesn't matter if it's the central government behind the system or the municipality. I think in the end, you should look at what is the end user value and how does he perceive what he gets or what he doesn't get. And the governments behind it should play their role and find their different role, because I think all kinds of governments, different level, have a role in creating this value for this end user. So I think it's difficult to say that there is one government in particular. No, I think it has to be a interplay of different governments where they have different roles. Because, to my opinion, a national government, of course, has more coordination and a broader view on things, where a municipality has more to do with the actual service delivery and feedback loops and all these kind of things. So my answer would be, it should be an interplay of different governments, keeping the value, the delivery value for the end user at front, and everybody has its own role in this interplay. Okay.
Thank you so much for your talk. And we can start with the next session in a few minutes, so feel free to grab a snack or some tea or coffee. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Boja,
you.
thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.